Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're really excited about tonight's guest. It's been a long time coming for us to cover this particular subject matter because it is a really complicated subject, and there are a lot of different perspectives on it. But Claire has so much experience that I think that it will have been worth the wait. Claire is a consultant, educator, and trainer who is based in Nepal. She has a background in international development and was a founding member of the Rural Development Organization Phase Worldwide. In the UK, she worked in development education, training teachers and supporting educational institutions and universities to develop curricula. She facilitated a global youth work project called Global Youth Action, working with disadvantaged youth, and coordinated a regional strategy for the UK government about how to embed a global dimension in schools. These days, she's a freelance consultant working mainly in the fields of public health, education, and anti-trafficking, and has previously lived and worked in Cambodia, Indonesia, and Senegal. So she has been to many different parts of the world. And driven by an insatiable desire to change the world, Claire first volunteered overseas as a teenager in Nepal. But the more volunteering she got involved with, the more she was confronted with the complexities of the aid world and the harm done by irresponsible voluntourism. Claire therefore shifted her focus towards advocating for an ethical approach to international volunteering. She's the co-founder of LearningService.Info, which is an information portal for potential volunteers. And she's the co-author of the book Learning Service, The Essential Guide to Volunteering Abroad, which was, and I have to say this because I love this, as far as testimonials go, I don't think you can do much better than this, but Noam Chomsky described it as an extraordinary contribution and a manifesto for doing good well. Welcome, Claire. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Wow, thank you, Tracy. That was an immense introduction. I'm going to have to do my best to try and live up to that, and especially to try and live up to Noam Chomsky, which I have to say is getting that endorsement was like the pinnacle of my life. I can't imagine doing anything like bigger or better than that. I'm so delighted to be here this evening for all of you, this morning for me. As Tracy mentioned, I do have a presentation, which is what I'll do is just go through basically a little bit of storytelling from the Learning Service book, and just do sort of like an overview of maybe in a very short period of time, some of the problems and some of the suggested solutions that we have, just to basically sort of whet everyone's interests and to start a conversation, not to get to any conclusions or, to go into any specifics. And then what we'll do is open it up to a question and answer. So I'm going to move quite fast through this presentation, so apologies for that. All of it, like just see which parts stick and which parts you might want to ask more questions about, and hopefully we'll get to that and sort of, explore the bits that you're all interested in. So really quickly, I'm Claire. Tracy did a really good job of saying lots of things about me. I'm British. You can probably tell that from my accent. I have a little cup of tea there because I'm also addicted to tea. I'm actually drinking my first morning tea right now. I'm normally based in Kathmandu, but for the last couple of months I've been here in Indonesia, and I will be talking a lot more about the research and experiences that led me to writing this book, Learning Service, The Essential Guide to Volunteering Abroad. Okay, so I'm just going to start off with basically just starting it with me and my story. And I always say that I was a student that wanted to change the world. And so when I was a teenager, I was like, oh, I need to go out into the world and volunteer. And I did that as a solo traveler. I also, I very much just sort of turned up in a place. I didn't know very much about Nepal. It happened to be the place that I first went to. It happened to be the place that I ended up staying in for the majority of my adult life. And I was really motivated to go out into the world and do good. And volunteer travel was the first thing that presented itself to me as an answer to this quest. And I was you know, I got really into it. I was really motivated by it. I started, I helped to co-found a non-profit organization that was really focused on helping Nepal. And I guess what happened was the more that I stayed and the longer period of time after, you know, like the first initial periods of travel, the more I realized that this was a very complicated field, and the more that I started to experience how, you know, good intentions and especially sort of short-term interventions such as volunteering could actually cause harm, could actually do the opposite of what it was intended to do. So what I thought we would do is go through an example of maybe like some kind of nightmare scenario of how volunteering could go wrong, and unpack that a little bit as a way to kind of find the kernels of like, what could we do to try and ensure that it goes right. So this is an example where basically everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. We'll explore each of the layers to that. This is an example that we talk about in the Learning Service book as well. And so just to give a little bit of context, it was a group volunteer program that I'm going to talk about, but this is all of the lessons that we're talking about are very applicable to solo volunteering, and actually a lot of solo volunteering, like, you know, if you sign up for a trip by yourself to go and volunteer, it often ends up as a group experience anyway. So it's like, you know, they'll pull together a group of solo travelers into a volunteer experience. So you can sort of extrapolate that into solo volunteering. This example is about it was like a high school trip where a group of high school students from Australia went to Cambodia. It was like a rural Cambodian village in order to improve education there by painting a school. So on the face of it, it's probably something that's like, you can recognize as quite a common sort of, you know, volunteer activity involved in kind of, you know, manual labor, rather than, you know, doing anything particularly complicated, and also very hard to imagine in the initial phases how that could have got on to do anything that could have caused harm. So let's explore actually what happened. So the way that the trip was organized is very common in this sector, in that there was like an Australian like volunteer organization that was based in Australia that sort of advertised different volunteer placements and then found local operators to run a volunteer program, to identify a project, like saying, we want to have a project that you know, involves improving schools. And then a local person would then go ahead and identify a place where that could be done. So the operator actually didn't have any presence in the country. They were relying on one person, and that person was given like a lump sum to like look after all of the logistics for the volunteers. And the way that they planned that was in order to kind of save money, and in order to you know, not have to pay for expensive accommodation or for transport. What they decided to do was to have all the volunteers stay in tents in the school grounds, the school that they were painting, to make all of the logistics easier, except for the fact that this project was happening in rainy season. And anyone that lived in that area, I actually stayed very close to that area, which is why I know this project so well. Everybody knew that the whole schoolyard became like a mud bath in rainy season. So what happened was all the volunteers came in, they put their tents up, and the first night was just a total washout. No one got any sleep. Everyone got all their clothes soaking wet and covered in mud, and it was really untenable. And so the local people decided, you know, in watching this, that all these guests had come into their community and, you know, they didn't have good conditions. The local people invited the volunteers into their homes, not for any extra money or anything like that, just, you know, out of kindness and like to be able to host these people. But we can already see this question of like, who is serving who in this scenario is already kind of, excuse the pun, it's a little bit muddy. Okay, so the next layer is about the project itself and how it was planned. So in talking to a lot of these volunteers, they said that they were not that worried really about, their accommodation situation, because they were actually happy that more of the money that they had paid for this trip, because each of them had paid like a significant fee in order to be there on this volunteer program. And the money, they were like happy that the money was going to the school instead of into hotels or, transportation or things like that. However, any of us that was on the other side and sort of looking at it from the community's point of view knew that actually none of the money that the students had paid had gone into the school at all. In fact, even the money to fund the paint that they were using was donated by another organization. So there was not a good understanding of those individual volunteers about where their money was going and what their actual impact would be. Okay, the next layer. Let's look at the project itself. So the project was about improving education in rural Cambodia. And the project that had been designed was to paint a school. Now, this school actually was a very underfunded school. It was a school that didn't have enough teachers. The teachers that were there were undertrained and really not very motivated. It had a huge number of students that were crowding the classrooms and not enough resources. Painting the outside of the school really wasn't something that was really going to significantly contribute to any of those issues. And it gets even worse, because the other thing that was again, people cutting corners with the project, is that basically the organizer just bought the cheapest kind of paint. And it turns out that it was indoor non-waterproof paint. And remember that this was the rainy season. So kind of what was happening is, as the students were going away and doing this project and painting the outside of the school, which is very hard. If anyone's ever been to Cambodia, it's a very hot country. And painting, if you're doing it, I think it was a 5-day project. If you're doing it from, as your only activity from when you wake up to when you go to bed, it's like quite a monotonous task. But to sort of feel like you're painting the stuff on, and meanwhile it's raining and it's all coming off again. The school was in session during this time, and so it was a very weird dynamic of the students climbing all over the school and painting, paint washing off everywhere, running into the playground, and it was getting quite messy. And again, what was happening is that the local people were saying, well, once these volunteers return, we're going to have to do something about this, and we'll have to paint the school again with proper paint. And so again, this question of who is serving who is coming into focus. And then we're going to go into another layer which relates, which is that the volunteer program didn't have any kind of orientation for the volunteers, and the volunteers were stepping off the plane and getting involved in a community project with their own cultural assumptions about what is appropriate. And if we can just put ourselves into the paradigm of young people in Australia for a moment, a lot of their clothes got really muddy, a lot of their clothes got covered in paint, and they were saying and it's really hot. Maybe the best thing for them to do would be to just wear their swimsuits while painting, in order to not destroy any of their clothes, and in order to not be too hot and all of these things. However, in rural Cambodia, which is a really conservative culture, wearing things like bikinis, you might as well be naked, the way the way in which it was perceived by the local people. And this is the point where the local people start getting really upset about the sort of values that they were seeing demonstrated by the volunteers. If you can imagine, we have students wearing swimwear while a school is in session. The local people who had invited these people into their house feeling quite upset with them. And it gets a layer of even worse, because these young volunteers were trying to motivate themselves, trying to finish this project. And on the final day, in order to do that, they brought some speakers so they could play some loud music. and caseloads of beer, and kind of had a sort of party atmosphere in the school grounds in order to get this done. Which you can imagine how that went down with the local people. They got quite upset and angry. The teachers were unable to control the classes anymore. The kids were running around like getting covered in paint, and they were like slightly tipsy volunteers, like having a great time and trying to do something that they genuinely thought was helping the community. So you can see that all this chaos unfolded, and I haven't even got to the worst part of this yet, which is we're going to look again at the person that was put in charge, the local person in Cambodia that was arranging all of this, who arguably was the only person that really benefited from this project, because he was the only one that I think within Cambodia made any money out of this project. And all that money was put into nefarious uses. Within a year of this volunteer group leaving, he was behind bars. He was actually the owner of a local orphanage, and it was discovered that he was abusing the children that was in his care. And so even though this project had nothing to do with this orphanage, the project really did support this man and the projects that he was a part of. And so in choosing this person and been not actually doing enough research to recognize that there was issues or corruption, the project ended up supporting something really nefarious. And I don't have time now to go into the issues of orphanages and orphanage tourism. There's a whole chapter on it in the Learning Service book. But again, any kind of volunteering with children, we have to think about child protection issues. What would it be like if they were our children that had, a stream of short-term volunteers coming in? Here, this is a campaign by an organization called Child Safe that really drums it home of like, why do people volunteer with children in a short term? Who actually is benefiting from this? So anyway, this is like one of the many layers of things that went wrong with this project. And I honestly think that even after everything that I've just described, possibly the worst outcome of all of this is that those volunteers went home and basically at the end of the project patted themselves on the back and said, that project was really hard, but we completed it. We did it. We've helped this community. And they really did not have any insight into the fallout that had happened. They didn't speak Khmer. They were only in the community for 5 days. They didn't have any chance of really understanding the complex dynamics of that community. And therefore, the good intentions of those volunteers were really misfired. And I think it's a real tragedy of failed volunteering, is that actually there's people out there that are really trying to do good in the world and that are not doing it, either because they're being misled by companies or because they're not doing enough research themselves. Really quickly, just looking into like, why does this happen? What we argue in the Learning Service book is that the model itself is broken. And we're talking about the sort of, I guess, more commercial style of volunteering, which is like where you sort of, find a volunteer opportunity online and then, have it set up for you by a commercial organization for a fee. The way in which people assume that this kind of volunteering must work is that there is like a project or a community that needs volunteers and that asks for volunteers, and then these companies step in and fulfill a demand. Having been on the other side of this is rarely the case, actually. What is much more normal is that there is a volunteer organization that is set up, as a profit-making organization that is more like a travel agent that has people saying, hey, I'd like to go to X country. Hey, I'd like to be involved in, a project with kids or something like that. And then that volunteer organization goes around contacting places that could host them. And then they might agree either because, it's a good connection, or because they get money for it, or because they assume that there's going to be, like some kind of benefit from that, which is outside of, especially a short-term volunteer program. It does become different when we're talking about longer term volunteer opportunities, but especially with this sort of what we call voluntourism model, where you go and volunteer for a short period of time, the benefit is not often what can be provided in a short period of time by a complete outsider. There might be other benefits that that are at play. And what we end up doing is, you know, creating experiences for volunteers that are more sort of like travel experiences, and sort of overlooking the cause, overlooking the like, what is actually the issues that we're trying to solve, and how are we best placed as you know, a short-term traveler to a community, how are we best placed to do something to address that. In the learning service book, we call it a band-aid solution. The idea is that, you know, we can do things that might momentarily address symptoms, but we might not be doing something that in the long term will solve these problems. And actually, they might contribute to perpetuating the problem if we're constantly doing these things that, you know, address the symptoms, but don't actually give any long-term resolution. Okay, so I have whisked through that story, and we've got to the point maybe where it's like the most disheartened of the talk. I will go on very quickly now just to talk about the philosophy that we call learning service, and like how we can come back from this, and like what are some of the principles to bear in mind if we want to do something like overseas volunteering, which is certainly not something that I personally write off. It's actually something that we, you know, the reason that we wrote the book is to sort of say it's really easy to tear this concept apart. Actually, how do we rebuild it? What can we do? What sort of steps do we need to take? How are we as individual volunteers, what approaches do we need to have in order to try to ensure that what we're doing at the very least is not causing harm? So just to talk about this, you know, where did the idea of learning service come from? In especially academic settings, volunteering is more frequently called service learning, to recognize the fact that actually one of the most important outcomes of doing service is learning. And we argued that in flipping this, we're really emphasizing that you can't just go in and say, I'm going to do some service and I might learn through it, but to say, actually, if I'm going to do service that is going to be useful to myself and to others, we have to do a lot of learning first, and we have to be open to learning throughout. And in fact, that has to be like our primary focus of everything that we're doing while we're volunteering is learning. We've mentioned the learning service book. It goes through a process of like learning what is it that you need to learn about. We start with learning about yourself, which is, you know, not necessarily what people think about when they want to sort of do a travel experience. But I think all of you, if you have done solo travel, I think learning about yourself is probably one of the biggest outcomes of all of it. But, you know, basically this idea of like, what are my motivations? Why do I want to do this? And how can I best achieve those goals, right? Taking a real step back from that and not assuming that, you know, I want to help the world, therefore volunteering is the answer. And then we go through all the learning about, you know, the history of volunteering, like how it came out of like colonialization, the bigger context of international development, and how does short-term volunteering fit into that. And then we basically go through a process of like, you know, if you're going to do some volunteering, what kinds of things, you know, do you need to think about, or, you know, what kind of attitudes might you need to imbue, or what kind of learning can you do while you're there? What kind of things to look out for? What kind of approach would you like to take? And then how can you embed this throughout your life? Because if there is anyone on this call that has done a successful volunteer experience, I would almost certainly bank on that it's had some long-term impacts, and those things should not be discounted. I know that not everyone on this call is going to have time to read the entire book. So what I like to do is to say that I can sum up the key messages of the book in 3 sentences, and I'm going to give you those sentences and just explain them a little bit. So the first one is that we have to learn before we can help. And this is like key to at least trying to make sure that we're not doing harm through our volunteering. The way that we explain that is that like a lot of volunteer experiences involve people that have never been to that country before, that may have never even met someone from that country, and doesn't necessarily have the context to understand the problem that they're trying to solve, or the solution that has been proposed in their volunteering. And what we're saying is that we want to just kind of nuance this a little bit, so that we're not having someone get off the plane being like, hi, I'm here to help you. My job here is to help. But to actually, you know, have the same experience, but to get off a plane and maybe with more nuance and a bit more humbly to say, hi, I'm here to learn from you about if and how I can be of help now or in the future. So it's sort of saying, you know, the same experience can be had with a different framing, and really, really different outcomes can come from that. And we refer to this as adopting a learning mindset rather than a helping mindset, because ironically, that will be something that will shift you towards helping in a more authentic way. Okay, the second sentence to sum up the book: the people that we need to learn from are those that we're trying to help. I think this is like important in terms of the power dynamics of volunteering. Sort of traditional ideas of volunteering is that there are volunteers that come in to help the beneficiaries. And it's like, you know, the volunteers are distributing their help, and the beneficiaries are kind of like passive actors, and they're like sort of waiting to be helped. And what we're trying to suggest is that if you come to a community as a learner, and you put the beneficiaries, you know, the people that have experienced these issues, the people who have first-hand knowledge of them, and usually first-hand knowledge of trying to solve the issues as well. You know, there are so many grassroots activists and organizations that are tirelessly working on these issues. If we go in as learners and say, hey, we're trying to learn about these issues and how people are trying to solve them, and I'm here to aid that quest, rather than, you know, like offer out any solutions that I have from my own perspective, we're completely flipping the power dynamic and making sure that local people are in the driving seat. Okay. Yes, this is just a photograph that I love of being in Nepal, with having local people teaching a group of foreign students, and just being sure that, like, you know, whose narrative is it that we're listening to when we're doing something like volunteering. Okay, the final point to make is that both learning and service are lifelong. If we're really interested in doing something like changing the world, then this is not something that we can do in a short-term period. So it's not about, you know, if we've got a week vacation, how are we going to save the world in that time? It's actually about looking at this as a more broader thing. Like, what are we doing in the rest of our time? How are we embodying this idea of volunteerism? How are we learning from any sort of experiences that we have abroad and applying that into our lives, right? In all kinds of ways that will add up to probably a much bigger impact over the time of our lives. So, you know, things like how we're consuming, things like how we're traveling, which I think is a really important part of all of this. Is if we are traveling, it's not that we get to travel however we want because we're volunteering, right? We should see this holistically. How are we traveling ethically, you know, and also maybe giving back something through volunteering? How are we voting? How are we showing up for others in our lives? What activism are we involved in? All of these things, you know, can stem from this drive to do good in the world, and viewing, you know, our overseas time as like a short contribution to what else we go on to do. So just to come back to my story and to like wrap this part up, I always say that I like set out as a young person with loads of questions, and what everyone always expects from me is that I'll say, yes, I went out and I did a load of research and I did a load of volunteering and I wrote a book on it, and now I have all the answers about how to volunteer ethically. And I would say more or less the opposite is true. That what we end up with after, you know, really diving deep into like, what is going on in the world and what is our place in it and what can we contribute, these questions result in a ton more questions. And the Learning Service book is really about how to ask good questions in order to arrive at better solutions for ourselves. So I'm definitely not here to sort of hand everyone the textbook, the blueprint of this is how you do good in the world, because I feel like, as the world is evolving, we're also evolving with our answers to these questions. And the important part is that we are consistently learning and asking these questions. So going back to me, I say that I am still a student who wants to change the world. I'm not a student in any of the academic sense, but with this sort of key focus of continually learning, then I would say yes, I'm still a student very much. I'm still open to learning. I find stuff out all the time that is about how to improve my impact in the world. And that is, what I'm encouraging everyone to do through the advocacy that I do. And that is the end of my very rushed presentation. I'm sure that we will have lots of things coming up from that. Just to say as well, if we don't have time in this discussion now, the Learning Service website has got a ton of resources and articles and things for people that are considering volunteering. And you're also very welcome to reach out to me personally if you've got further questions or specifics that you'd like to go into. Okay, I will now stop sharing my screen and come back to you all. And maybe I'll just pass it over to Tracy to sort of moderate a discussion.
Okay, that was wonderful, Claire. Thank you so much. It occurred to me as you were talking that a lot of these, this learning service approach, we would be well advised to do that even at home. I find, when people are volunteering within their community or another community within their city, that we do that same thing, that stepping in, I'm here to help rather than I'm here to learn. And I really love this approach.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. We often say that learning services an approach to life that we have applied specifically to volunteering because that was our field, but it can be applied to loads of things. It certainly can be applied to travel. It can certainly be applied to, like you said, volunteering at home, but also any kind of non-profit donation that we do. I feel like often it's we want to do something good and we're presented with an easy way to do good, and that we don't necessarily sort of do the research or really find out whether the actions that we're taking, are they actually in line with our values, and do they have the impact that we're assuming that they do.
Right. Well, I think we have a few questions from people. So let's see. David is wondering if it's possible, if you could recommend some reputable organizations, especially for people with technical or scientific backgrounds, to make a contribution.
Interesting. That is always the question that we get. That is always the first question is okay, you've scared me a bit, tell me the good organizations. And again, there's actually a chapter in the book about why we don't necessarily do this. I think one of the reasons is that, firstly, there is just such a diversity of options for how to volunteer. There are so many there are thousands of providers. There are also just ways, and I'm sure all of you are solo travelers, you might be more inclined to just sort of go to a place and then see if you can volunteer while you're in a place. That is another way that it happens. There's also people that just apply directly to a nonprofit that they like the look of from overseas. There's just so many ways to do it, which is why we sort of suggest an approach. The other thing is that things change a lot. Organizations improve their services through feedback. Organizations, we suddenly will have a scandal and we'll realize it was really corrupt all along. So it's really, we don't want to sort of hand out the list and then be like, you know, responsible then for like all of the problems that then. Having said that, if you have a particular background, this is, you know, I think a really good starting point, which is that if you have like tangible skills that you know are things that are needed by, you know, organizations all over the world, there are ways in which you can kind of match your skills to organizations. So it depends on how long you have. There are like longer term programs. So in Canada, actually, I know a lot of you are from Canada, there is the organization VSO that used to be QSU, I believe, which is for like long-term volunteering that is like skills-based, that matches people with particular backgrounds to particular, it's basically like having a job at that level where it's like, you know, and you can sort of rely on an organization doing that to a high level. There are also shorter term volunteer organizations that do that. I would say that if you're like really thinking about how to sort of use your skills in a way that will, like, you know, result in greater skill transfer, then you do have to look into like a slightly longer term commitment. So I would say like 1 to 3 months would probably be the minimum amount. That isn't to say that you can't do successful things that are more short term, but it is like, you know, looking at what kind of impact do you want, how do you want to use your skills. So I would look at organizations that are, you know, specifically for your field. You know, there are organizations like Engineers Without Borders, which also has a branch in Canada and a branch in the UK that you can reach out to, you know, like that have specific like engineering problems that, you know, need engineers to kind of volunteer on. So that is the direction that I would look at if you're really looking at like, you know, this more sort of like professional skills-based volunteering and less of a like, you know, travel and trying to like fit in wherever it might be possible approach.
Okay, good advice. And I think that might also answer Terry's question, which was when you're speaking about long-term volunteering, what sort of time frame are we talking about? And I guess it would sort of depend on the type of volunteering as well.
Definitely. And I think, you know, like quite often a lot of the criticisms get really thrown at like kind of short-term, you know, because this term voluntourism, which I think is often used in a sort of you know, like a sort of satirical way sometimes these days, but I certainly wouldn't say that it's like long-term volunteering good, short-term volunteerism bad. It's definitely not as clear-cut as that. And like we say a lot, it's about the approach and it's about what you're trying to get out of it and what others are trying to, you know, like what kind of impact you're hoping to have. And with longer-term volunteering as well, if, you know, for example, you don't do good research or good skills matching, you know, and an organization is corrupt, or it turns out that, you know, the job that you're in is something that you actually can't do very well, or if it turns out that the volunteer themselves isn't going in with the kind of attitudes that would lead to, you know, a sort of the impact that you want, then it sort of doesn't matter how long you spend in a placement, right? It's like, really it's about how we're approaching these opportunities. So while we do say that there is a correlation between spending longer and a greater impact from the, like, let's say the volunteer like input, it doesn't necessarily follow like that. And also short-term volunteer opportunities can have immense impacts on individuals. It can also be really inspiring for, you know, local organizations and activists. And it can the impact of that, like it can create an impetus for something that is bigger. So yeah, so it's not as clear cut as that. So it does depend on your goals, which is why we always start with yourself. We always start with your own motivations. What is it that you're trying to get out of this kind of opportunity?
Right. Okay. Jeff is asking, are there related or alternative vacations or trips for learning and service? So maybe a volunteer vacation isn't the best way to learn, help, and grow. For example, learning about the culture, the language, that sort of thing.
Absolutely. So that is actually something that we really recommend, and it's something that the reason that I'm now in Indonesia is that I'm part of like a study abroad. So I'm actually like, so Princeton University does something called a Bridge Year, which is like a study abroad program for their undergraduates. So I'm just like leading that at the moment. And that is fully focused on learning. There are other organizations as well. So the field of educational travel, which is, you know, a field that I've done a lot of work in, which is basically sort of removing this necessity or this sort of burden for needing to do something, needing to like make a difference. You know, I've only got a really short period of time. How am I possibly going to know, you know, what to do in order to kind of have a good impact? Well, you know, I would certainly argue that if you've got a short period of time, the most important thing that you can do with that time is to start to understand issues. So there are like educational travel providers that will take you around and, you know, help you understand the issues facing countries, help you meet local leaders that are like tackling things, you know, help you understand the culture in a deep way, and sort of start this journey of like, you know, not just into that country and culture, but also into global like issues, into our place in the world. You know, the idea of global citizenship, like what can we do if we're coming from a more like a relatively privileged background, which usually is a situation with outside travelers going to another place, that there's like a mismatch in you know, access to resources and things like that, and then to start this journey of like, you know, what can I contribute and how can I understand the world in a better way, and possibly through that, yes, maybe going back to that country again and volunteering, maybe going somewhere else and volunteering, maybe doing something completely different with that motivation. But yes, seeing it like that. And so I would say, yes, there are like organizations that do educational travel, learning journeys, kind of like cultural immersion, study abroad, which is what I'm doing now. These kinds of opportunities, I think, can be really, yeah, like sort of good alternatives to short-term volunteering.
Okay. Karen says, I imagine that those that came before you can damage expectations. She had a friend who volunteered in the Peace Corps and became so frustrated, came home early because the locals only wanted money from him. He thought he would be working, repairing, and teaching. And she asks if you often run into that type of issue as well.
Very much, it's very common. I think, again, when we're talking, you know, like one of the reasons that we focus so much on the approach to volunteering rather than like, you know, sort of more like, you know, lists of tips of like, this is good and this is bad, is because there is so much that can be caused, or like so much that can be set up through volunteering. We talk a lot about power dynamics, about how, again, if we see, and you know, to make broad generalizations, it's usually sort of global north developed countries, majority white countries, that are volunteering in global south developing countries that are majority non-white. And even the like optics of that can set up things that are really damaging. And the expectations of people overseas can be, this person's going to come in and lead us or give us some answers, which is not very healthy, and honestly can be really damaging and dangerous sometimes. You know, we get a lot of, you know, young people, you know, age 15 or something, that have traveled overseas and then are asked to do things that are way beyond their skill set, because people assume that like, oh, they must be, you know, an expert in something, or, you know, they must be, you know, they can speak English, therefore they can teach English, or like, you know, they are educated, therefore they must be a doctor, you know, these kind of things. And then the expectations of monetary gain, the expectations of like, you're really rich and, you know, you're not helping me. And it's not as clear cut as like, oh, these people should actually just focus on the service that they're getting, because sometimes there are really difficult dilemmas of, you know, people being in difficult situations and feeling like, oh, my rich friend, my rich foreigner friend will be the one to help me out. You know, like I've got a family member in the hospital, you should pay for that because you've got money. And it is, you know, there's lots of things that are really confronting about not just traveling in lower income countries, but, you know, putting yourselves in situations where you are exposed to all of that. So like, we've got sections in the book about what to do when you're confronted with, you know, children begging. It's a very nuanced situation. It's not as black and white as, you know, we would like to think. And the reality is that if you go in as a volunteer and sort of have an idea of, okay, this is what I can contribute, or, you know, my goal is to sort of help, you start to realize really quickly that there's a bigger context, and there is like, you have to set a lot of boundaries for yourself. You have to set expectations well with like local people, and there's lots of I mean, I've like lived in Asia for like, I would say the majority now of in fact, I always say the majority of my adult life. It's coming up to the majority of my life. And I still encounter these kind of moral quandaries all the time, you know, of like, what is the best thing for me to do in this situation? Or, you know, where, you know, like what do I consider corruption and what is actually just a cultural thing that I can let go? I go back and forth on some of these things all the time.
It's very complex. Yeah.
It's extremely complex. And that's, so before we wrote the Learning Service book, we were actually, Learning Service was just like an advocacy group. We set up the website and we were like writing articles and like doing, you know, soundbite advocacy and sort of saying, you know, avoid this, do this. And then people would ask us all the time for like top 10 tips, or like, you know, people like journalists would interview us and say like, what can you do to ensure this? And the more that we started giving these kind of soundbite answers, the more we realized like, we can't even stand by our own advice if we're like, these are the top 10 tips, because we're like, we've seen someone follow all of those top 10 tips and still fall into trouble because of this other thing. So that's where we're like, we actually just need to write a book and put all of this into like this bigger context of, you know, so that it is this continual learning journey rather than a tick box exercise.
Right. Okay. This is an interesting question because so Betty is asking if you're familiar with Workaway, and if that's a good way to use your skills locally. And in my mind, I always think of Workaway as a trade-off for accommodation. I don't think of it as volunteering per se, but she's wondering if that's a good way to be able to use your skills locally in a community.
Yes, it can be. And we've also had a lot, you know, when we're doing research for the Learning Service book, we had a lot of people sort of give us, you know, like warnings about it, or like things that have gone wrong. I think, you know, one thing that you can look at with Workaway is that at least there is some need that is being fulfilled, because it's like more of a trade-off. So, you know, a lot of, you know, other volunteer programs, especially the like pay to volunteer things, you can pay to volunteer to do anything. There doesn't necessarily need to be a need there. Whereas with Workaway, you know, someone is saying, I need this so much that I'm willing to offer, you know, XYZ, whatever it is. So that is one way in which you can sort of like look for authenticity. I think with Workaway also, you can look for hosts that have been doing it for a longer time, because then you can see that the expectations are more well matched. I think the stories that I've heard about it going wrong are like, the area of like getting into exploitation of like, actually, you know, something that should really be a paid job is they're just sort of like inviting people in to do it. And you know, especially when it comes to someone that is running some kind of like luxury resort or like, you know, something like that, and then asking for people to come and like be the administrator because they don't want to pay someone, even though they're making loads of money. Or
so that's an interesting something that hasn't come up also, is that idea of volunteering but taking away a job from a local, right?
Yes, that is another thing that is an issue. I think what we find a lot of the time with like, it's more often with short-term volunteering that it's more like you're doing a completely superfluous job that has been made up that, you know, a local wouldn't do because, you know, that job has been created for a volunteer. But it is possible that there are, you know, again, like people that are trying to just use volunteers instead of, you know, paying people. I think it happens in schools a lot, whereas people assume that they can just get overseas volunteers to come and teach English instead of paying for an English teacher, and piece together through short-term volunteer stints, like a language program, which is disastrous for children's learning. And so you do often, like, you know, like what we'll say is that if you're interested in doing teaching, then supporting a usually underfunded and undermotivated teacher in a classroom, and, you know, also bolstering their position in a community, rather than taking that away and then having everyone, you know, invest their time and energy into a volunteer. You know, something else that we argue really strongly is that volunteers are not free. This is often assumed, and it's assumed by the workaway hosts that have had less experience with hosting volunteers as well, is that, you know, you actually have to invest a lot in order to make a volunteer, you know, useful. Like the amount of training or management or supervision that a volunteer needs. Sometimes they need like translation if they're working, you know, in a different language. They often need a lot of support because they're new in a country, right? They might need support in like going to the shops, and, you know, like there's loads of different layers to it, and that can maybe not be understood by volunteer hosts. And then actually the other thing on, just again, not specific to Workaway, but I have heard about it from Workaway, is that there are like kind of like sort of almost like scams that are put up there that like are people not wanting access to foreigners. Sometimes they don't even have a project. Sometimes they assume that the volunteer can bring the project and bring the money for the project. So again, it's about research, no matter what the platform is that you're going through.
Right. Okay. We are quickly running out of time, so I'm going to just ask you a couple more questions. On that topic of doing research, Jeff is wondering how you find effective worldwide organizations that are looking for non-medical scientists, teachers, et cetera, just a simple internet search, or do you have any tips for how to find those?
Yeah, again, we have in the Learning Service book, like different ways in which you can go about it. An internet search is a totally valid search, and being very specific about what you're looking for, but not going with the first things that come up, because obviously the ones that, you know, again, like big profit-making companies have all the ads, they have their SEO maximization. I think it's really about taking the time to look through and say, like, is this matching with what I'm looking for? And sort of, you know, going on to the, you know, being very specific with your search terms and going on to like several pages of Google, and actually just like weighing up things, and look at, you know, comparing across different organizations. We actually have, there's a chapter of the book called Learning About Your Options, which is all about kind of different ways. A lot of people have told us that, you know, word of mouth, like finding out someone else that has had a really successful volunteer experience and then going from there. It might not be you do the same thing, but it might be that you get, you know, the tips from how they did it, and then sort of try and apply that to you, or you contact that organization and then are put in touch with that. I think we're looking for organizations that are really transparent and that are not sort of selling the chance to save the world, and that are not using what can be referred to as poverty porn in their marketing. You know, there's lots of, we have a whole thing about red flags with organizations, so you can look at that. But I think the main advice is that you do need to take time to research and to weigh up your options. And when people say to us, I don't have the time to do that, then we would say you probably don't have the time to do like ethical volunteering, which is okay. You might just need to have a travel experience, and there's no shame in that. You know, wait until you have the time to do the research, you know, well, in order to go for your volunteer thing.
Right. Okay. This is a question that has come up before when we posted it in our Facebook group, which is, do countries often have regulations related to volunteering? Is that another something else that people need to consider?
I think our answer is that we wish that they did more often. It's because of sort of volunteering sitting on this really interesting cusp between sort of serious, let's say, international development work and tourism. It's often really hard to know where volunteers lie and what regulations apply to them. And usually it means that no regulations apply. So for example, in Nepal, which is a context I'm very familiar with, you are not allowed to volunteer on a tourist visa. However, it's estimated that 30,000 people per year pre-pandemic were coming to Nepal to volunteer. You have to, like, on your visa application, you have to say that no paid or unpaid work will be done by you, because they're very concerned about people taking jobs. However, you walk around the tourist area of town and there's people advertising volunteer opportunities all over the place, because it's not enforced, and it can't be enforced, unless there's a lot of investment, which might be like misdirected investment really by the Nepali government. And I think actually this is why it's really exploited. This is why we can link international volunteering to sex trafficking. It's why the orphanage issues exist, of children being exploited by the tourist industry, is because there isn't regulations for this, especially in lower income countries. And this is one of the main reasons that we went into this advocacy, was to seeing these really explicit links and wanting to be able to do something about that, or at least just to raise awareness so that people are going in a more mindful way.
Right. We are pretty much out of time, so I'm going to just ask you one last question that I think we can leave on a bit of a happy note. Karen is interested in knowing what has been your favorite volunteer project that you have encountered in as you've traveled around.
Okay, I have so many. And it might not have sounded like that from the way that I talk. I often sort of tell the horror stories in order to get people thinking, but there are loads of really good volunteer projects. And I think some of the ones that I love are things that are really simple and really sort of, I guess, egalitarian, and that really challenge these power dynamics that we were talking about. There's a volunteer project that runs in Nepal. It happens every Saturday, and it is like a totally local organized thing. And it is people going into the Bagmati River, which is one of the most polluted rivers on earth, and pulling out plastic bags. And they go around different areas of the city of Kathmandu and just have a load of people do this like really like menial like work. But some people that are involved in it, some of the people that I've met doing that project are like, professionals. I met a doctor there once, people that just really care. They're like, this is our environment and it's really shameful that it looks like this. And I love getting international volunteers involved in that, even if they're volunteering with something else, just as this thing of like total solidarity. We're going to just go in and do this like lowest form of work. And it challenges the volunteers. It challenges local people when they see people coming in and doing that kind of work. They're like, oh, this is actually embarrassing for us that our rivers look like this and foreigners have to come in and do this. And then just another example of, similar, maybe not quite as as like physically muddy. There was a volunteer project that had it was basically an exchange between Nepali young people and foreigners that came into a community. Like there were students that were like around the same age, and they came into a community, and for a week they built a medicinal garden in the school. And the way in which they did it was by getting the local young people to take out the foreign young people, and they went into the forest and identified medicinal herbs. And it was a really amazing learning experience for the there were a group of youth from the US, because they were like, not only are we so impressed by the skills that all these local students have, but it's made us realize that we don't know any of the plants in our own communities, and we don't know what they do. And all these young people that, you know, we assumed would be less educated than us, and we'd assumed when we said we were going to do a project in the school that we would be teaching them. Now we've realized that how much they know, and they're teaching us all this stuff, and they really reflected back on, you know, like what they don't know actually. And it was this really powerful learning experience for both of the groups. So anyway, just a couple of examples that off the top of my head.
That's great. Thank you. This has been fascinating. Thank you so much, Claire. And thank you again for getting up so very early in the morning to be with us. We really appreciate it. And this is, we will, if people stick around for a moment, we're going to do a giveaway. But I just wanted to say thank you, Claire, and I'm going to be ordering your book right away, because there's sounds like there's so much in there that we couldn't possibly cover in an hour here. So thank you again.
And thank you all so much. Thank you for this opportunity. I love talking about this. That's probably been clear. Teddy Banyak. And yes, please feel free to reach out or follow up if anyone has any further things they'd like to talk about.
Great. Thanks so much.